They handed their own daughter to a mafia boss to save themselves, and the moment she walked through his door, everything they thought they'd buried came back to destroy them. This is the story of Celeste Ashcroft, the woman who was hidden in a basement, handed over like a debt payment, and rebuilt an empire from the ashes of betrayal. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me until the very end, because nothing about this woman's story is ordinary. Part 1. The rain started just after 11. It came without warning, the way most disasters do. A low-pressure system that meteorologists had been tracking for 3 days, suddenly deciding it had waited long enough, dumping itself across the eastern seaboard in sheets so thick you could barely see your hand in front of your face. On the 47th floor of the Ashcroft Imperial Flagship Tower, the windows turned black and opaque, and the city beyond disappeared entirely, which meant that anyone watching from outside, had there been anyone watching, had there been any reason to watch, would not have seen the light burning in the sub-basement, would not have noticed the thin yellow glow seeping from beneath a door that most employees didn't know existed. Celeste Ashcroft noticed the rain only because the pipes sweated. The records office sat at the bottom of a maintenance corridor on the building's lowest functional level, wedged between a decommissioned boiler room and a fire suppression junction that hadn't been serviced in 6 years. She knew it hadn't been serviced in 6 years because she was the one who had filed the maintenance request. Twice. The second time in writing, with the estimated liability attached. Nobody had responded. Nobody ever responded to anything that came from this office, which was fine, because nobody was supposed to know this office existed, which meant nobody was supposed to know she existed, which was, by now, after 4 years, simply the ambient condition of her life. She was 31 years old and she spent her nights in a basement. She told herself it was a choice. On the good nights, she almost believed it. The desk she worked at had been someone else's once, back when this floor had served some function she'd never been able to determine from the records. The wood was dark and scarred, the surface covered now in a topography of her own making. Ledgers stacked by fiscal year, manila folders color-coded along their top edges, a single laptop connected to an Ethernet cable because the Wi-Fi signal didn't reach down here, and she hadn't bothered asking anyone to fix that either. There was a space heater plugged into a surge protector. There was a thermos she refilled twice a night from the break room upstairs, climbing 4 flights of maintenance stairs rather than using the elevator, because the elevator had a camera and the break room on the 8th floor had a camera, and she had learned over 4 years that the less of herself she left in the footage, the smoother everything ran. Smooth. That was the word she used in her own head. She kept things smooth. Tonight was not smooth. She had found the first irregularity 3 weeks ago, buried in a vendor invoice for linen services. A number that was $40 too high, which should have meant nothing, which would have meant nothing to anyone who hadn't been staring at these particular vendor accounts for 38 consecutive months. She had flagged it quietly, opened a separate ledger column, started tracing backward. The $40 became $400, became $4,000, became a pattern, a beautiful, horrible, meticulous pattern running across 7 different vendor accounts, 7 different shell companies, 7 different sets of invoices that passed every standard audit because they were standard audits. Nobody checking standard audits looked for the thing she had found, which was that every inflated invoice corresponded to a payment window that fell outside the primary accounting cycle by exactly 11 days. 11 days. Whoever had set this up had understood the accounting cycle perfectly. She had understood it better. Celeste sat back from her laptop now and pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes until she saw spots. She was tired in a way that had stopped having anything to do with sleep. It was the kind of tired that settled into your joints, into the back of your skull, into the particular muscle between your shoulder and your neck that never fully unclenched anymore. She had been awake for 22 hours. She had eaten half a protein bar at 6 in the evening and forgotten the rest. On the screen in front of her was the number she had spent 3 weeks trying to make wrong. $3,840,000. Not missing, not misallocated. not the result of an accounting error or a rounding discrepancy or any of the comfortable explanations she had allowed herself to consider in the first 2 weeks. The money had moved with intention, with structure, with the kind of careful scaffolding that took either genuine expertise or a very patient teacher. Through Ashcroft Hospitality Group's operating accounts, through a facilities management subsidiary, through 3 vendor shells she had now traced to a single registered agent address in Delaware. Then offshore, to a correspondent banking arrangement she was still untangling, and from there, she stopped. She pulled up the document she had been avoiding for 40 minutes. The one she had printed, then folded, then unfolded, then folded again, because looking at it felt like standing too close to something that might bite. The registered agent for all 3 shell companies was a law firm. The law firm had one primary client of record, in the one public filing she had been able to locate. The client's name was A. Moretti Holdings, LLC. She knew that name. Everyone in this building knew that name, even if they weren't supposed to say it, even if the knowing lived only in the careful way people lowered their voices when certain guests checked in the extra sweep the head of security did on those particular floors, in the way her father's entire demeanor changed when certain phone calls came through, stiffening, smoothing, becoming the version of Reginald Ashcroft that smiled too precisely and agreed too quickly. Adrian Moretti. She had never seen him, had only ever traced the edges of his presence through the financial footprints he left behind, through the way his name rearranged the air in rooms she wasn't supposed to be in. What she understood about him, she understood the way she understood everything, through numbers. And the numbers told her that Adrian Moretti was not a man who made mistakes, which meant this was not a mistake, which meant someone in the Ashcroft organization had made a very deliberate decision to route nearly $4 million through structures that pointed, ultimately, toward the most feared criminal enterprise on the East Coast. Her hands were cold. She pressed them flat on the desk and breathed. The question she needed to answer, the question she was afraid to answer, was whether her father knew. She started with what she had. The invoices ran back 27 months, but the authorization codes on the initiating transfers were internal, which meant access to the primary treasury module, which was restricted to 7 people: her father, her uncle, the CFO, the chief accounting officer, and 3 members of the treasury team she had trained personally. She eliminated the treasury team in 20 minutes. Their access logs didn't align, and 2 of them had been on leave during the first wave of transfers. The CFO and chief accounting officer were possible, but the authorization pattern suggested someone who understood the treasury module at an architectural level, not an operational one. That left 2 people. She stared at her screen. The boiler room behind her wall made a sound like something settling, like old metal accepting weight. She had grown used to the sounds of this basement. She had grown used to a lot of things. Celeste opened a new tab and started pulling the access logs for the executive level. She knew her father's patterns. She had spent 4 years learning them, because knowing them was the only way to do her job, which was to fix things before they became problems, which was to keep the empire running without anyone having to acknowledge she was the one running it. She knew that Reginald logged into the Treasury module at 7 a.m. every Monday for his weekly review and never touched it again until the following Monday. She knew her Uncle Tristan accessed it irregularly, sometimes twice a day, sometimes not for 3 weeks, but she had always attributed that to his personality, which was irregular in general, and charming about it, which was what made him dangerous. She pulled Tristan's access history for the past 30 months. The pattern emerged in under 8 minutes. Every single initiating transfer, all 47 of them, spanning 27 months, had been authorized during a window that fell between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. on nights when Reginald was logged as out of the building. Tristan's active sessions ran longest during those windows. The authorization codes matched to a secondary credential set she hadn't known existed, had only found by tracing the system's session token architecture, which she had spent the last 6 hours doing because she hadn't been able to sleep, and the numbers kept pulling her back. Tristan. Her uncle, who had put his hand on her shoulder at her mother's funeral and told her she was the strongest woman he knew. Her uncle, who had laughed at every board meeting when her father cut her off mid-sentence, who had called her Celeste the Calculator like it was a nickname and not a diminishment, who had signed off on her performance reviews with consistently outstanding ratings while consistently ensuring she had no title, no office, no seat at any table that mattered. Her uncle had stolen $3,840,000 from the family business and routed it through a criminal organization's shell structure. And her father, she went back to Reginald's logs, looked harder this time, looked for what she hadn't looked for before, which was not activity, but absence. Specifically, documentation. The kind a careful man would generate if he discovered what she'd just discovered. The audit flags, the internal notices, the record of concern. There was nothing. A clean absence. The kind that was only possible if a man had decided not to look. Reginald hadn't found this. He had declined to find it. She sat with that for a moment. Then she heard the elevator. The sub-basement had one elevator and one stair access, and the elevator was not supposed to move after midnight without a security override code. She heard it anyway. The distant mechanical groan of a counterweight, the subtle shift in pressure that came when the shaft activated. She checked her phone. 12:47 a.m. She closed her laptop. It was instinct, pure and immediate, the same instinct that had kept her invisible for 4 years. She gathered the printed documents, folded them, tucked them into the lining pocket of her cardigan where they would lie flat against her ribs. She closed the 2 additional browser tabs she'd been running, cleared the session cache, unplugged the Ethernet cable, and coiled it under the desk. She was standing beside the desk, not at it, when she heard footsteps in the maintenance corridor. 3 sets. No. 4. She recognized her father's walk by sound before the door opened. He moved like a man who had never once in his life worried about taking up space. Heavy, deliberate. The kind of step that expected the floor to absorb it without complaint. She recognized Tristan by contrast. Lighter, quicker, the walk of a man who was always arriving slightly ahead of himself. The other 2 she didn't recognize until the door opened and she saw them. Large men, dark coats. The specific stillness of people who were accustomed to standing in doorways and waiting to be told what to do next. Her father stepped through first. He looked at her the way he always looked at her. Scanning, measuring, finding her insufficient, and then he looked at the desk, the closed laptop, the cleared surface, and something crossed his face that she couldn't read. Her uncle came in behind him. Tristan's smile was already deployed, the full wattage version, the one he used when he needed someone to believe him very quickly. And then the man behind them. She had been wrong about not knowing what Adrian Moretti looked like. She had simply never assigned a face to the name, the way you might know a city exists without having an image of its skyline. He was taller than she had expected, which was not why she went still. He wore a dark suit that had not been purchased recently and did not need to be. He moved without the deliberateness her father used, without the forward lean her uncle used, without any of the performed authority she had learned to read in men who needed you to know they had it. He moved like a man who had nothing to prove. He looked at the desk. Then he looked at her. "This is the one," he said. His voice was quieter than she expected. That was the second thing that went wrong with her assumptions. Her father cleared his throat. "This is Celeste, my daughter." Adrian Moretti was still looking at her. Not the way men looked at her in boardrooms, which was to say, through her, past her, at the chair beside her, or the window behind her. He was looking at her directly, with the focused quality of someone reading something carefully. "She was in the office," Tristan said, and his voice carried that particular lightness he deployed when he was managing a situation, when he was translating something uncomfortable into something palatable. "Late night. She has access to the accounting systems, obviously, given her role." Her role. 4 years of keeping this building solvent, and her role was a phrase her uncle used when he needed to explain her presence to someone more important. "Mr. Moretti," her father said, and his voice had the precise smoothness of a man performing a transaction. "As we discussed, the discrepancy in the accounts. Our investigation has identified the source." She understood then. Not slowly, not in stages, was. All at once, the complete picture assembling itself from the pieces she had already gathered, from the absence in her father's audit logs, from the shell structure she had spent 3 weeks tracing, from the fact that Tristan was smiling at her. They had known she was down here. They had known what she was finding, and they had made a decision about what to do with that information before she had finished making her own. "Your investigation," Moretti said. He was still looking at Celeste. "The transfers were initiated using her credential set," Tristan said. Secondary authorization codes, yes, but traceable to her access. She trained on the full Treasury architecture when she joined the company. She had the knowledge and the access. It was elegant. She gave him that, despite everything. It was genuinely elegant, because she had trained on the Treasury architecture, because her credential set was on record, because she was the one who understood the system well enough to have constructed exactly what she had just spent 3 weeks unraveling, and that expertise was a blade that could cut in 2 directions. "My daughter," Reginald said, "has been working independently, below our visibility. The evidence points—" "I'd like to hear from her," Moretti said. Silence. Her father blinked. It was very brief, barely a disruption of his face, but she had spent her life reading Reginald Ashcroft, and she caught it. Moretti had moved his attention fully to her now. His expression was neutral in the way that certain things were neutral. Not empty, but waiting. "You're going to tell me you didn't do it," he said. Not a question, an observation. She looked at him. She thought about the documents against her ribs. She thought about the access logs she had run, the session tokens she had traced, the 11-day window that had taken 3 weeks to find. She thought about her father, standing in the door of the basement office where she had spent 4 years, and she thought about the word collateral, which was the word men like him used when they meant daughter. "I can show you exactly who did," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was the only thing she could say in its favor. Moretti studied her for a moment that stretched well past comfortable. "All right," he said. Then he looked at her father, and something in his expression shifted. Barely, subtly, the way a key turns in a lock without making a sound. And Reginald Ashcroft, who had never been afraid of anyone in Celeste's memory, looked away first. "She comes with me," Moretti said. "We'll settle this at the estate." She didn't fight it. There was nothing to fight with, and she understood that fighting would cost her the one thing she still had, which was the documents against her ribs and the knowledge in her head and the 3 weeks of work that nobody had managed to take from her yet. She walked out of the basement office between 2 men in dark coats, in front of a man whose name rearranged rooms, past her father, who did not look at her, and her uncle, who watched her go with an expression she finally had a name for. Relief. The elevator doors closed. The sub-basement fell dark behind her. Outside, the rain was still coming down. The car was a black SUV with tinted windows and no interior door handles in the back seat. She noticed that immediately, the absence of the handle, the smooth panel where it should have been, and filed it alongside everything else she had noticed in the last 11 minutes. The driver's route, which avoided every major intersection. The second vehicle trailing 30 feet behind, the way the larger of the 2 men flanking her had positioned himself with his left shoulder forward, which meant he was right-handed and expected to need that hand. She noticed these things not because she knew what to do with them, but because noticing was the only form of control she had left, and she was not ready to give that up. The rain hammered the roof of the vehicle in a register that made conversation impossible, which suited her. She needed to think. The documents were still against her ribs. She had not reached for them, had not shifted in her seat, had not done anything to suggest she was carrying something worth carrying. The 2 men beside her stared forward. Adrian Moretti sat in the front passenger seat and had not turned around once since they left the tower. She could see the back of his head, the line of his shoulders, the way he held himself, still, but not relaxed. There was a difference, and she had learned to read it. She thought about her father's face when Moretti had said, "She comes with me." Not guilt, not grief. She had looked for those and found neither. What she had found was the expression of a man completing a calculation that had taken considerable time and effort, finally arriving at the answer he had been working toward. A settled look. The look of a closed account. 31 years. She had given that man 31 years, and the best he had managed in return was to use her as a line item. She breathed. In through her nose, out slowly, the way she had learned to breathe during quarterly audits when the numbers were bad and the board was watching, and she needed to present information that would embarrass people twice her age without letting any of them see that her hands were shaking. Her hands were not shaking now. She was too tired to shake. The estate was 40 minutes outside the city, which meant 40 minutes with the rain and the silence and the 2 men whose breathing she had already memorized. When the SUV finally turned through a gate she couldn't see clearly in the dark, she felt the road surface change beneath the tires. Smoother, private, The kind of pavement that was maintained because someone cared enough to maintain it. The house was larger than she expected and darker than seemed practical. Most of the windows were black. 2 exterior lights flanked the main entrance, enough to see by, no more. The men in dark coats moved efficiently when the vehicle stopped. Doors opened, a path was established, and she was inside before she had fully registered the exterior. A foyer, stone floors, high ceilings with the kind of structural bones that suggested age, and furniture that suggested someone had stopped trying to update the place some years ago and made peace with that. Not neglected. Maintained. There was a difference. She was already making distinctions like that, cataloging, because it was what she did, because her brain would rather organize an unfamiliar space than sit with the fact that she didn't know what happened next. "Sit," said one of the men. There was a chair, a good one, old leather, solid frame. She sat. The men took positions near the doorways and became furniture themselves. Moretti moved to the far end of the room, picked up something from a heavy oak sideboard, and poured 2 fingers of something amber into a glass. He did not offer her any. He stood with his back to the room for a moment, looking at the wall, and then he turned and looked at her. "Talk," he said. She had prepared for this in the car, or she had tried to. The problem was she didn't know what he wanted. Whether he wanted a confession wrapped in the right language, whether he wanted the truth and would know it when he heard it, whether it mattered at all. What she had decided was this: she would give him exactly what she had. Numbers, facts, the trail. She would let the trail do the arguing because arguments could be dismissed and numbers, when they were right, could not. "Can I use a surface?" she said. "Something to write on." He studied her, then he moved to the sideboard and came back with a legal pad and a pen. He held them out. She took them. "The transfers run back 27 months, she said. 47 transactions. The amounts range from $60,000 to $240,000, structured to stay below the thresholds that would trigger automatic review. The total is $3,840,000. She wrote the number, turned the pad toward him. "That number is precise because I spent 3 weeks reconstructing every transaction from the originating account to the offshore correspondent. I can walk you through every step. Or you can have someone check my work. I'd recommend checking my work because if I'm wrong about any of it, I want to know." Something shifted in his face. Not much. Enough. "The transfers were initiated using a secondary credential set," she continued. "Not my primary access credentials. A secondary set, generated through the Treasury module's administrative backend. I found them because I know the system architecture. I helped design the authorization protocol 4 years ago." She paused. "The same protocol that whoever set this up used to generate those credentials in the first place." "So you're telling me the knowledge cuts both ways," Moretti said. "I'm telling you that knowing how something was built is not the same as having built it. I can also tell you that the initiation timestamps for all 47 transactions fall within a window between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. on nights when Reginald Ashcroft was logged out of the building. I can tell you that the active session logs for those windows show a consistent pattern of access from one other executive credential." She looked at him steadily. "I can tell you whose." He was quiet for a moment. He had not sat down. He was standing with the glass held loosely at his side, watching her the way she imagined he watched most things, without performance, without impatience, with the quality of attention that belonged to someone who had learned that waiting cost less than rushing. "You're very calm," he said. "I'm not calm," she said. "I'm tired. There's a difference." That seemed to land somewhere. He pulled the chair from beside the sideboard and sat down across from her, and for the first time since the basement office, they were at the same level. "Show me," he said. She showed him. She worked for 2 hours on the legal pad, reconstructing the transfer architecture from memory. Account numbers, routing sequences, the shell company structure, the registered agent connection, the correspondent banking arrangement. She drew it in the way she thought about it, which was as a diagram of decisions, each node a choice that someone had made, each line a consequence. She narrated as she drew, precisely and without editorializing, because editorializing was not what this moment needed. He asked questions, good ones, specific, structural, the kind that told her he understood what she was showing him at an architectural level, not just operationally. At one point, he stopped her and said, "The 11-day offset, how did you find it?" And she explained the cross-referencing method she had used, which had taken her the better part of a week to develop. And he listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he said nothing for a moment and then said, "That's not something you stumble on." "No," she said, "it isn't. You were looking for it." "I was looking for the $40 discrepancy in a linen invoice. The rest of it found me." He considered that. "Why didn't you take it to your father?" It was not phrased as a question. He already knew. She answered it anyway. "Because his logs showed he had declined to look," she said. "An absence of documentation at exactly the point where a careful man would have generated documentation." She set down the pen. "Reginald Ashcroft is a careful man." The room was very quiet. One of the men by the door shifted his weight. "So he knew," Moretti said. "He knew enough to stop looking." Another silence. She watched him process it, watched the pieces arrange themselves behind his eyes, the calculation running, and she recognized that look because it was the look she wore when the numbers finished telling her something she hadn't wanted to hear. "The names connected to these shells," he said. "A. Moretti Holdings." "Yes." "Someone wanted those transfers to point at me. Or someone wanted to use your infrastructure and assumed the connection would never be traced." She paused. "I don't know which. That's a question I don't have the data to answer." He stood, walked to the window, which showed nothing, the rain still pressing against the glass. She watched his reflection, his face in the dark glass, the set of his jaw. "The men who brought you here," he said. "You noticed their positions. When you sat down in the car." She went very still. He turned. "The left shoulder." "You looked at it for 2 seconds." "Yes," she said, "because lying about it now would cost more than admitting it." "What did you conclude?" "That he was right-handed, that he was positioned for action, not observation, that he'd been told to watch me specifically." She paused. "Not that I plan to do anything about it. I notice things. It's not useful in the way you're probably thinking." "How did you know it wasn't useful in the way I'm thinking?" "Because you're still talking to me," she said. "If I were a threat, you'd have already decided what to do about that." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. Less than that. And somehow more. An acknowledgement. He came back to his chair and sat down again. "You've been in that basement office for how long?" he said. 4 years. "Doing what?" She thought about how to answer that. The accurate answer was everything. The accurate answer was the things that kept the building standing, the things that caught the problems before they became crises, the things that ensured the quarterly reports looked the way boards of directors needed them to look, the things that nobody had a title for because having a title would have meant acknowledging she existed. She thought about the water damage on the 9th floor she'd caught before it reached the electrical systems, the vendor contract she'd renegotiated at 1 a.m. because the original terms would have triggered a covenant violation, the payroll error she'd found and corrected for 43 employees who never knew their Christmas deposits had been in jeopardy. "Whatever needed doing," she said. "For what compensation?" She looked at her hands on the legal pad. "A salary. A small one." "Title?" "No." "Credit?" She didn't answer. He had all the answer he needed from her not answering. He was quiet for a long time after that. She heard the rain. She heard the distant sound of a door somewhere in the house. Voices briefly, then nothing. She was running on the wrong side of 24 hours without sleep, and she could feel it now. The particular unreality of extreme tiredness, the way the edges of things lost their sharpness, the way her own thoughts seemed to lag slightly behind themselves. "You should sleep," he said. She looked up. "You're not a prisoner," he said. "You're a guest who is not currently free to leave, which is a distinction I'm aware is meaningless to you, but is the best I can offer tonight." He stood. "One of the rooms upstairs. Someone will show you." "I need to know what you're going to do," she said. "I'm going to verify what you've shown me. And then we'll have a different conversation." It wasn't enough. She knew it wasn't enough, and she also knew she had no mechanism for making it more. So she stood, and her knees ached from the hours in the hard chair, and she picked up the documents from her cardigan lining and held them out. He looked at them, looked at her. "The printed records," she said. "I brought them from the office. They're more complete than what I've drawn here." He took them. His fingers were careful with them, the way she was careful with evidence, not reverently, just correctly. She followed the man he nodded toward up a staircase she didn't look at carefully enough. Through a hallway she noted only in the vaguest terms because her brain was running on reserve, into a room that was clean and dark and had a window she registered as being on the north-facing side of the house. The bed was there. She sat on the edge of it and then lay back and was asleep before she had consciously decided to sleep. She did not dream. Or if she did, she didn't remember it. What woke her, 6 hours later, was the sound of a controlled argument somewhere below. She came awake fast. That was the thing about sleeping light for 4 years, about always being the person who had to notice things, about calibrating herself to the frequency of problems. And she was sitting up with her feet on the floor before the voices resolved into words. She checked the window. Gray morning, the rain gone, a pewter sky that suggested it was thinking about coming back. The voices were downstairs, 2 of them. One she recognized. She opened the bedroom door. The hallway was empty. She moved to the top of the staircase and stopped there because the voices were in the room below, and she could hear them clearly now. Doesn't align. Any of it. That was Moretti. His voice had a different quality than it had last night. Not louder, but tighter. Compressed. With respect. A voice she didn't know. Male, measured, the voice of a professional. The credential architecture she described doesn't exist in the system documentation I've reviewed. The secondary authorization set. Find it! Mr. Moretti, if the set doesn't appear in... It doesn't appear in the documentation because it was generated through the administrative backend and never logged to the primary system record. She told you where to look. Look there. A pause. She's very specific, the other voice said, carefully. Yes, Moretti said. She is. That level of specificity could suggest. It could suggest she built it. It could also suggest she spent 3 weeks tracing it. Those are 2 different things. A sound, a chair, movement, the session token architecture. She described a cross-referencing method. Run it yourself. Don't interpret it, just run it. Bring me what it shows. Footsteps. A door, silence below. She waited. Then she went downstairs. Moretti was standing at the window with coffee she hadn't been offered. He heard her on the stairs and turned before she reached the bottom. You slept, he said. 6 hours. She looked at the room. A proper office. She could see now in daylight, with actual filing systems and 2 monitors on the desk that were both active. Your man is skeptical. My man is cautious. It's what I pay him for. What will the session token cross-reference show? If you're right, it'll show exactly what you said it would. I'm right. I know, he said. That stopped her. He said it without qualification, without the diplomatic head she'd expected, I know, and the certainty in it was not performed, which meant it came from somewhere. She looked at him. You've already looked, she said. I looked at 3 of the transactions last night after you went upstairs. The offset pattern, the credential timestamps. He turned back to the window. It took me 40 minutes to confirm what you spent 3 weeks building. You have a very particular mind. She didn't know what to do with that. She stood in the middle of the room, and her stomach made a sound that reminded her she hadn't eaten in close to 20 hours. There's food, he said. Through there. She went through there. There was food. She ate standing at a kitchen counter that was cleaner than she expected. Eating toast she made herself because the alternative was asking someone, and she was constitutionally incapable of asking for things in unfamiliar spaces. And she thought about what came next. Thought about Tristan and the smile he'd had when they walked her out of the basement. Thought about her father and the closed account expression. She was still thinking about it when Moretti appeared in the kitchen doorway. My man found the secondary credential set, he said. She swallowed her toast. The initiation logs for all 47 transactions, he said. Time-stamped, session-linked, traceable to a single executive credential. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't name. Your uncle's. Yes, she said, and your father's access logs show a pattern of deliberate non-review that begins approximately 2 months after the first transfer. He paused. He didn't set it up, but he found it and said nothing. He found it and said nothing, she said, and when I started finding it too, they needed someone to hand over. He was quiet. They owe you money, she said. It wasn't a question. The shell companies, the correspondent banking, the offshore routing, none of that was random. Someone had needed those structures for a reason. Tristan didn't build a pipeline to your organization's infrastructure because he was ambitious. He built it because your organization was already in the building, and at some point the money flowing through that pipeline started flowing the wrong direction. Moretti's face was absolutely still. How much do they owe you? She said. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through something. Trees, she thought, though she hadn't seen trees from the upstairs window, she hadn't been paying attention. And the house settled with the small sounds of old wood and older stone. More than they can pay, he said. So they gave you me instead, she said, and the evidence that I built it, so that if you ever needed to demonstrate that the money disappeared into somewhere, you'd have a name that wasn't theirs. The silence stretched. That is a very clear-eyed way to describe being betrayed by your own family, he said. She set down the toast. I've had 4 years of practice being clear-eyed about my family. He looked at her steadily, and then he said the thing she had not expected, the thing that changed the shape of the next hour and the next day, and everything that followed it. I'm going to need you to stay here. I know, she said, not as a prisoner. I heard you the first time. As someone whose testimony I may require, he said. When I go back to settle this with your father and your uncle, I will need someone who can explain what they did in terms that cannot be dismissed or confused or buried. That person is you. She thought about the basement office. She thought about the chair where she had spent 4 years. She thought about Tristan's smile and her father's settled expression, and the $40 in a linen invoice that had started all of this. All right, she said. You understand what it means. If I go back there, it means they'll know you know, she said, and they'll know I'm the reason. Yes. They'll try to bury the evidence. They can't, she said. I know where all of it is, and I know how they built the parts I couldn't find from the basement. I know because I trained the people who built it, and I know the weaknesses they built in because they were trained by someone who believed in redundancies. She looked at him. There's no version of this where they can clean it up fast enough. He studied her for a long moment. The morning light through the kitchen window was thin and gray, and it made everything look exactly as complicated as it was. They're going to move, he said, when I don't respond the way they expected. When they realize you're here and talking instead of disappeared, they're going to move assets, try to restructure the shells. Then we need to move first, she said. He nodded, very slightly. And then his phone rang. Not a ringtone, a vibration, the handset buzzing once on the counter where he'd set it. He picked it up and looked at the screen, and his expression changed in a way she caught only because she was watching for it, the way she watched for everything. He turned the phone toward her. It was a text, 4 words from a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was the Ashcroft Buildings district. The 4 words were, she kept copies everywhere. And below that, 1 more line from the same number, sent 30 seconds later. We need to talk. Alone. There are things about your daughter she doesn't know. The sender ID was listed as R. Ashcroft. Her father was texting Adrian Moretti directly. Her father, who had handed her over as a debt settlement the night before, was now reaching out to the man he'd handed her to, bypassing her, reaching around her, moving again. And the message that accompanied it was designed to do one specific thing, which was to make her a liability instead of an asset. There are things about your daughter she doesn't know. She looked at the screen. She looked at Moretti. His expression told her nothing. That was the problem. 4 years of reading people had given her a very good sense of when a face was telling her something and when it was being deliberately held, and his was being held, which meant he was deciding something, and she did not know which way that decision was going to fall. What things? She said. Her voice was flat. I don't know yet, he said. Are you going to find out? He looked at her steadily. Yes. The word landed between them, and she felt, for the first time since the elevator doors had closed in the sub-basement, the precise shape of how little ground she was standing on and how far the drop was in every direction. She took the phone from his hand. He let her, which she noted. He could have pulled it back, could have turned the screen away, could have made any of a dozen small movements that would have established whose information this was and whose decision it was to share it. He did none of those things. He held the handset out and let her take it, and watched her read the message again, which she did, twice. Because the first time her eyes moved over the words without fully processing them, the way your mind sometimes refuses the thing it's being shown. There are things about your daughter she doesn't know. Her father. Texting the man he'd handed her to. 11 hours after the handover, in the gray morning of the day after, reaching sideways around her to plant something in Moretti's ear before she could get there first. She thought about the timing. She thought about Reginald Ashcroft's particular genius, which was not financial and not organizational but personal. The genius of knowing exactly when a person felt most stable and choosing that moment to destabilize them. She set the phone down on the counter. "He's trying to split us," she said. "Yes. Before we've established enough of a working relationship to make splitting difficult." She thought about it. "Which means he's moved faster than I expected. Which means he was already prepared for this specific scenario. Which means—" She stopped. "He expected you to talk," Moretti said. "He expected me to find the documentation, and he expected if I ended up somewhere I could talk, that I would talk." She looked at the kitchen window, at the flat gray morning. He built a contingency for it. What does the contingency look like? I don't know yet, but the message is the leading edge of it. He's not going to tell you whatever he's going to tell you over text. He wants a meeting, alone without me, and he wants you to agree to it before I've been here long enough to make myself indispensable. She turned and looked at Moretti directly. Are you going to agree to it? He looked at her for a moment. Not yet. Not yet. She filed that. What could he have on you? He said. It was a blunt question, asked without apology, which she respected more than she would have respected the diplomatic version. I don't know, she said. Think. She thought. She thought about 31 years of existing in proximity to Reginald Ashcroft's operations without ever being fully inside them. The particular position of someone trusted with the infrastructure, but never with the decisions. Someone who kept things running without being told what, precisely, was being run. She thought about what that position had exposed her to, and more importantly, what it had required her to do. The contract she had signed because her father pushed the papers across a desk, and she had trusted, at 23, at 25, at 27, that the papers were what he said they were. The authorization she had added her name to, the documentation she had filed. Something cold moved through her. There may be... She stopped, thought more carefully. When I started in the records office, I was given signature authority for a range of operational documents, standard facilities contracts, vendor agreements, maintenance authorizations. I signed hundreds of documents over 4 years. I reviewed the ones I could access fully, but there were some, late submissions, time-sensitive approvals, where I was given summary documentation rather than the underlying agreements. Moretti was very still. If someone structured a secondary document to align with the summary, your signature appears on something it shouldn't, potentially. She felt the shape of it opening beneath her, the drop she'd been circling since last night. I don't know on what. I don't know how many. I would need access to the full execution files, not just the summary records I was given, which are in the records office, which are in a building I left 11 hours ago under armed escort. He turned, picked up the phone, set it down again without doing anything with it. He's been building this for a long time, Moretti said. Not to her exactly. To the room. He builds everything for a long time, she said. It's the one thing he taught me worth keeping. He looked at her. How do we get into those files? She noticed the we. She didn't remark on it. I have remote access to the records management system, she said. My credentials are still active. They'd have to disable them manually, and that requires the CFO's authorization code plus my father's, which means 2 people who may not be in the same room yet this morning. She glanced at the clock on the kitchen wall. It's 7:14. My father doesn't reach the office until 8. His morning routine hasn't varied in 4 years. If my credentials are still active, use them, he said. I need a device that isn't connected to anything that can be traced back here. He left the kitchen. She waited. He came back with a laptop, matte black, older model, the kind that didn't advertise itself. Clean, he said. She opened it and started working. The remote access portal for the Ashcroft Records Management System was not a sophisticated piece of technology. It had been built in-house 7 years ago by a contractor whose primary qualification had been cost, and Celeste had spent 18 months after his departure quietly patching the worst of its vulnerabilities without telling anyone she'd done so, because telling anyone would have required explaining how she'd found them, which would have required explaining how much time she spent in the system at hours when nobody knew she was there. She had her own access path, not a back door exactly, but a maintenance tunnel she'd built for herself after the third time the primary login portal had crashed during a critical filing deadline. She used it now. The system loaded. Her credentials resolved. She was in. She went directly to the execution file archive, searched by her signature authority code, and started pulling the list of documents she'd signed. The system returned 412 records. She filtered by date, by document type, by the specific filing categories that corresponded to the kind of agreements she'd been handed late and signed on summary. 43 documents. She started opening them. The first 8 were exactly what she'd been told they were. Facilities contracts, service agreements, nothing that would give anyone leverage over anything. The 9th was a vendor agreement with a logistics company she didn't recognize. She opened the underlying contract rather than the summary. She read it twice. Then she sat back from the laptop and looked at the ceiling. What? Moretti said. He was standing behind her, had been reading over her shoulder. She'd been aware of it and hadn't minded because the entire exercise was for his benefit as much as hers. This logistics company, she said. The summary described it as a maintenance supply vendor, third-party janitorial and facilities consumables. She scrolled to the underlying contract. The actual agreement is for secure document transport and off-site storage. High security, the kind used for... She stopped. Read again. Evidentiary materials. He leaned forward. Signed by me, she said. 18 months ago, authorizing the secure off-site transfer of records designated by executive instruction. She looked at the authorization clause. The designation authority is listed as Reginald Ashcroft or his appointed representative. So anything your father wanted moved out of that building was moved under my authorization. Yes. She clicked through to the appendix, including a records transfer dated 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks before she had found the $40 discrepancy in the linen invoice. 6 weeks before she had started pulling threads. He moved the originals, she said. Her voice came out flat, and that flatness was a structural thing, a load-bearing thing, because underneath it her mind was doing something that had no professional description. It was simply the experience of watching the floor you thought you were standing on turn out to be a ceiling, and below it, nothing but open air. The original transfer records, she said. The initiating documents for the 47 transactions. The underlying authorization files that connect the credential sets to the individuals who generated them. She looked at Moretti. 6 weeks ago, I authorized their removal to a secure off-site facility. I have no record of having done so. My signature is on the authorization. Where did they go? I don't know yet. She was already searching, her hands moving on the keyboard with the automatic quality of someone operating below the level of conscious decision. The logistics company address is, this is a registered address, not an operational one. I need the secondary filing. She pulled up the addendum. Read it. Her hand stopped. The off-site facility, she said, is listed under A. Moretti Holdings, LLC. The room was completely quiet. She turned and looked at him. He was already looking at her. He moved the originals into your storage infrastructure, she said. My signature on the authorization. Your company's name on the receiving facility. She could hear her own voice working, steady, precise, the voice she used in crisis, and some distant part of her was impressed by it, by the sheer mechanical loyalty of a voice that kept functioning when the rest of her was in freefall. If someone goes looking for the original documents that prove the fraud, they find them in a facility connected to you, and the authorization that sent them there has my name on it. So the physical evidence, he said, is sitting in your infrastructure, authorized by me, which means if the fraud is ever formally investigated, it points at us, he said. Both of us. Both of us. She turned back to the screen. She needed to think, and she needed to do it fast because the clock on the kitchen wall now read 7:38, and Reginald Ashcroft was 22 minutes from his office. She kept searching. She opened the remaining 35 documents from her filtered list. She needed to know the full shape of what she was looking at before she could figure out whether any part of it was salvageable. 20 documents were what their summaries had said they were. 10 were variations on the logistics theme, different company names, different categories, but the same structure, the same authorization clause, the same off-site transfer mechanism. The remaining 5, she opened the first one. She read it. Then she closed the laptop. Not because she needed to stop, because her hands had done it on their own, some autonomous part of her deciding the rest of her needed a second before it kept going. Moretti waited. He was good at waiting. She was starting to understand that it was one of his fundamental qualities. The patience, not passive, not indifferent, but the patience of someone who understood that information arrived at its own pace and pressure didn't make it arrive faster. "There's more," she said. "Tell me." "One of the documents I signed 22 months ago is a property interest agreement." She pressed her hands flat on the counter. "It appears to assign a partial operational interest in the Ashcroft Imperial flagship property to an unnamed investment partner, with the understanding that the partner's identity would be established in a sealed addendum." She breathed. "The sealed addendum is not attached to my copy. I signed the primary agreement. The summary described it as a renovation financing instrument." "A renovation financing instrument," Moretti said. "Yes. And it was actually a partial ownership transfer of the flagship hotel to an unnamed partner whose name is in a document I've never seen and cannot access." She looked at him. "If the sealed addendum names anyone, you, me, anyone connected to this situation, we have a problem that goes beyond fraud documentation." He pulled out a chair and sat down. For the first time since the kitchen, he looked like a man recalculating, the internal machinery visible for just a moment in the set of his expression. "Your father," he said, "spent 22 months building a structure where you are personally and legally connected to every piece of documentation that could be used against him. The fraud evidence is in your signature's custody. A property transfer bearing your signature potentially conveys interest in his assets to parties of his choosing. And the supporting credential architecture for the original theft is designed to collapse, on investigation, onto an executive credential that..." He stopped. What credential set was used for the original 47 transactions? She had already thought of it. She had thought of it the moment the execution files started resolving on the screen. "The secondary credential set," she said, "the one I said was generated through the administrative backend. The one you said you didn't know existed. The one I didn't know existed. But if someone investigated the backend, they would find the generation event in the system logs," she said. "And the generation event would show a timestamp and a user session and a device fingerprint." She felt the shape of it fully now, the complete architecture, and it was, even now, even at the bottom of what it meant for her, extraordinary in its construction. "The device fingerprint would match the laptop in my office." Silence. "I used that laptop for everything," she said. "For 4 years. I used it for the records management, for the financial reviews, for the maintenance scheduling. It was the only device I had. And if someone used it to generate a credential set, physically sat at my desk, in my office, with my machine, the log would show my session, my device, my location. Did anyone else have access to that office? No one was supposed to." She stopped. Something snagged. "The cleaning crew had a master key. Facilities staff. And..." She stopped. "Who?" "My uncle," she said slowly, "kept a set of emergency keys for every sub-level space in the building. Standard procedure for executive access. He established it himself 2 years into my tenure." Moretti's jaw tightened. "He was in my office," she said. "He was in my office at some point during a window where I was logged in but not present. I go upstairs twice a night for coffee. I told you that. And he used my machine to generate the credential set. She stood up. She needed to move. She walked to the kitchen window and stood looking at the gray sky and felt something happen in her chest that was not grief and was not rage, but was the very specific sensation of watching a careful person's careful work be turned against her with the precision of a craftsman. The irony is that I found the secondary credential set by tracing the session token architecture, which means the investigation I ran to prove the fraud also proves I was sitting at that machine when the credentials were generated, because the session was mine. She turned around. Moretti was looking at her with an expression she finally had a name for, because she had seen it before. She had seen it in the mirror in the weeks after her mother died, and her father had come into the records office and told her to take 3 days off and then come back and be useful. And she had held it together until he left, and then sat in her chair and looked at her own reflection in the dark laptop screen. It was the look of a person being asked to absorb something they should not have to absorb. "He didn't just plan to hand you over," Moretti said quietly. "He planned for you to end up exactly where you are. In my house, talking to me, with documentation that points in all directions except the right one." She said nothing. "Because if you ran," he said, "you'd run toward the evidence, and the evidence led here, to me. And being here talking to me is itself evidence of conspiracy," she said. "Yes." The phone on the counter buzzed. They both looked at it. Moretti picked it up, read it. His expression did something she hadn't seen before. A very brief, very controlled movement of the muscles around his eyes, the kind you made when you needed the rest of your face to stay still. He turned the phone toward her again. Her father. Another text. Sent 8 minutes after the first, which meant he had sent it at 7:24 a.m., 14 minutes before his supposed arrival at the office, which meant he was already there, which meant his routine had changed, which meant she had been wrong about the one constant she thought she could count on. The message was longer this time. She has a sister, biological, relinquished at birth. The adoption was private and sealed, but the paperwork exists. The sister's current name is Mafia Boss. She is an investigative journalist at the Hargrove Sentinel. She has been investigating your organization for 14 months. Her source, the person who has been feeding her information about your operations, is Celeste. The documentation I can provide to support this has your daughter's fingerprints on every page. Celeste read it 3 times. The kitchen was very quiet and very still, and the clock on the wall read 7:43, and she could feel her own heartbeat in the side of her neck, in the place where her pulse was visible when she was under pressure, the place she had learned to cover with her collar in boardrooms. "I don't have a sister," she said. Her voice was not as steady as it had been. "I don't have a sister," she said again, because saying it twice seemed important, seemed like the kind of thing that needed to be asserted twice, even though the second time it came out with less certainty than the first. Because the thing about Reginald Ashcroft's genius was that he never put something in writing that he couldn't support, and she knew that, and knowing it was a specific kind of horror. Moretti set the phone down. "Mafia Boss," he said, and the way he said it told her immediately, told her before he said another word, that the name was not unknown to him. "You know her," she said. "I know the byline," he said. "I know the investigation. I know that someone has been feeding the Hargrove Sentinel internal information about my operations for over a year, specific information, the kind that required primary source access, not secondhand sourcing." He looked at her. "I have been trying to find the source for 11 months. The drop was back. The open air below the false floor. "I'm not the source," she said. "I know that." "You know that. You've been in a basement for 4 years. You don't have primary source access to my operations. You have secondary source access to the financial architecture that my operations move through, which is a different thing." He picked up the phone again. "But your father knows that too, which means the documentation he has doesn't prove you're a source. It proves that I know things a source would have to know," she said, "and that my signature is on documents that moved information-adjacent materials in directions that could be characterized as intelligence transfer." She pressed her fingers to her mouth briefly, dropped her hand. "How bad is the Sentinel investigation?" Bad enough that I have legal exposure in 3 jurisdictions if it publishes. And if I'm named as the source. Then I have a different problem, he said. Because the woman I brought into my house, who spent the night here, who has been in my office since this morning, becomes the link between the information I've been hemorrhaging and the journalist on the other end of it. She understood. She understood completely, and the understanding was cold and exact, and she let it be both of those things because the alternative was panic, and panic was a luxury she could not afford. He's not going to call you, she said. He's not going to meet you. The offer of a meeting alone, that was the setup. He wants you to refuse it, or to accept it under the wrong terms so that he can show a record of you being in contact with him directly about this. Moretti looked at her. He's not your problem, she said. He never was. You're his solution. He needed someone with enough resources and enough reputation that being connected to you was itself a jeopardy. He's been using your infrastructure without your knowledge for 27 months. He's put my signature on documents that connect me to you. He's suggested to you that I'm connected to a journalist investigating you, and now he's waiting to see which one of us destroys the other first. And if neither of us do, Moretti said, then he has a problem, she said, because the only scenario he hasn't accounted for is the one where we don't. She said it before she'd fully thought it through, but once she'd said it, she understood it was true, and more than true. It was the only door left standing. Moretti looked at her for a long time, long enough that she became aware of the sound of the house around them again, the wind outside, the small mechanical voice of the clock. Tell me what you need, he said. She exhaled something that was not quite relief, because relief required a destination, and she didn't have one yet. I need access to the Ashcroft Building's physical files. I need the sealed addendum on the property interest agreement. I need to find the original transfer documents my father moved to your storage facility, which means we need to figure out which facility it actually is, because I guarantee the address in the contract is a layer away from the real location. She paused. And I need to talk to Mara Voss. Moretti went very still. Before your people find her, she said, before my father finds her, before whoever she's been talking to for 14 months realizes the ground has shifted. She looked at him with the steadiest eyes she could manage. If I have a sister, if that part is true, then she's the one person in this situation who has spent over a year documenting it from a direction nobody knows about, and she's about to become a target. The clock on the wall read 7:51. Her father was in his office. Tristan was somewhere, moving, doing whatever the next part of this required. The ground beneath her was made of signatures she didn't remember signing, authorization she'd been handed on summaries, 4 years of careful loyalty turned into a precision instrument pointed back at her throat. And the one door left standing required her to walk through it with the man whose name had rearranged rooms for as long as she could remember, toward a sister she had not known existed this morning, to stop a plan that had been running longer than she had been paying attention. Moretti moved first. He picked up a different phone, not the one her father had texted, a separate handset, and dialed. When it connected, he said only 4 words before ending the call. Find Mara Voss, now. He set the phone down and looked at Celeste. We leave in 20 minutes, he said. And somewhere across the city, in a newsroom she had never been inside, a woman who shared her blood and didn't know it was already opening her laptop to file the story that would either save them both or bury everything they had left. The car moved fast through streets that were just beginning to fill with morning traffic, and Celeste sat in the front passenger seat this time, not the back, not between 2 men who were furniture, but beside Moretti himself, who drove with one hand and held the secondary phone with the other, listening to reports she could only half hear over the engine noise and the wind coming through a cracked window. She was running on 6 hours of sleep and 1 piece of toast, and the specific fuel source that had no name but that she recognized from the worst nights in the records office, the kind of alertness that lived on the other side of exhaustion, where your body had stopped arguing and simply complied because the alternative was stopping entirely. She watched the city come back into view as they crossed the bridge, and her stomach tightened. Voss is at the Hargrove building, the man in the back seat said. He had a name. She'd learned it this morning. Declan, 1 syllable, no elaboration. And he had a laptop open and was reading from it with the toneless efficiency of someone reporting weather. Came in early. Badge log shows 5:48 a.m. She's filing, Celeste said. Moretti glanced at her. If she came in before 6, she's filing. That's deadline behavior. Celeste pressed her thumb into the inside of her wrist, the pressure point she used when she needed to think clearly, the one she'd discovered by accident at 24 during a quarterly review that had almost ended the company. She has a publishing window, and she's in it. How long? Moretti said. If the story's already written, hours. If she's still compiling, less certain. But the fact that my father moved when he moved, sent those texts when he sent them, suggests he's aware of her timeline too. She thought about it. He may have been the one who told her it was time. Why would he accelerate his own exposure? Because he's not exposed in her story, she said. If I'm the source and you're the subject, the story is about both of us. He's the aggrieved patriarch who had no idea. He emerges as the victim of a conspiracy between his own daughter and the man she allegedly fed information to. She looked at Moretti. It's not his exposure, it's his exit. 3 beats of silence. He gives up the hotels, Declan said from the back seat. Takes the sympathy and the insurance payout on whatever the investigation claws back. And Tristan? Moretti said. Tristan's already insulated, Celeste said. The credential architecture points at me, not him. He'll present himself as someone who discovered the irregularities but was afraid to come forward. Afraid of me. Afraid of... She stopped. Afraid of you. A man who found out his niece was collaborating with organized crime and didn't know how to handle it. Moretti's jaw was set hard enough that she could see the muscle working at the corner of it. He spent 27 months building this, she said. Both of them. This is not improvisation. The Hargrove building appeared ahead. A mid-rise with a glass front and the kind of ground floor lobby that made journalists feel like their work mattered. Moretti pulled the car into a loading zone without ceremony and stopped. You go in, he said. Alone. She looked at him. If I walk into a newsroom, he said, the story writes itself in the wrong direction. If Declan goes, same problem. You're the only one who can walk through that door without making it worse. He was right. She hated that he was right. What do I say to her? The truth, he said. All of it. Starting with what your father put in that text. She got out of the car. The morning air was cold and carried the smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. She walked through the lobby, gave her name at the desk, her real name, her full name, Celeste Ashcroft, and watched the receptionist's expression shift in real time as the name registered, because her family's name was the kind that registered even in places that didn't want anything to do with it. I need to speak with Mara Voss, she said. Tell her it's about the story she's filing today. Tell her the source situation has changed. She sat in the lobby and waited. Mara Voss came down in 4 minutes. Celeste saw her before she was close enough to read her face, saw her the way you saw a reflection in an unexpected mirror, the shock of recognition before the mind had fully processed what it was recognizing. The height was the same, the angle of the jaw, the way she held her shoulders, which Celeste had always attributed to the habit of sitting too long at a desk, and apparently it was genetic. She wore a press badge clipped to a dark jacket, and her hair was shorter than Celeste's, and her eyes, when she got close enough to be readable, were the exact same shade as the eyes Celeste had looked at every morning for 31 years. Mara Voss stopped 3 feet away. She looked at Celeste. Celeste looked at her. You're not a source, Mara said. Her voice was different, lower, quicker, a journalist's voice, the voice of someone who had learned to process information faster than most people could deliver it. You're her. We should go somewhere private, Celeste said. They found a conference room on the 2nd floor, glass-walled but empty, and Celeste sat down and gave Mara Voss the compressed version. 20 minutes, no editorializing, the same structural clarity she'd used with Moretti in the estate office. The fraud, the credential architecture, the documents she'd signed, the logistics company, the storage facility, the sealed addendum on the property transfer, and then her father's text, which she read aloud word for word because reading it aloud from memory felt more honest than paraphrasing it. Mara didn't interrupt. She had a reporter's notebook open on the table, and she wrote in it with a pen that moved fast without seeming to hurry, and she listened with the complete, almost physical quality of someone for whom listening was a trained and practiced skill. When Celeste finished, Mara looked at her notebook for a moment. My source, she said. The one who has been feeding me information for 14 months. You want to know who it is? Yes. Mara looked up. Tristan Ashcroft. The conference room was very quiet. He came to me, Mara said, presented himself as a whistleblower, said he had information about Adrian Moretti's organization moving money through legitimate business structures. He gave me documents, financials, internal communications. He said he was afraid to go to law enforcement because he didn't know how far the contamination went. She paused. He knew I had a sealed adoption record. He found me specifically. He said it was because he trusted me, because I was family. Celeste felt her hands close on the table edge. He told you who you were, she said, 14 months ago. Mara's voice was controlled with the effort of someone keeping it controlled. He told me I had a half-sister, that my biological father was Reginald Ashcroft. He said he wanted to protect me, said the story was the best way to do it, get it published, get Moretti's operation exposed, keep me from becoming collateral damage when it all came apart. He was building you, Celeste said. I know that now. Mara set the pen down. The documents he gave me, I had them verified by 3 independent sources. They checked out, but they checked out because they were real documents that were real evidence of real crimes, just not the crimes he told me they were evidence of. She pressed her fingers flat on the notebook. How much of my story is real? The money movement is real. The shell structure is real. The offshore routing is real. Celeste looked at her steadily. What's not real is the attribution. The crimes are your uncle's. He built an architecture that survived verification because the underlying facts were true. He just changed the names. Mara closed her eyes for 1 second, opened them. I have a publishing window in 4 hours, she said. I know. If I miss it, the story dies. The editor kills it. I've been running this for 14 months and I don't get another window like this. If you publish it in its current form, Celeste said, you destroy the one person who can actually give you the right story. Mara looked at her. Me? Celeste said. Celeste's phone buzzed. She looked at it. Moretti. Your father is on the move. Tristan, too. They're heading to the Imperial. Now. She stood. I need to go, she said. You can't just come with me or don't, Celeste said. But if you come, bring everything you have. Every document your uncle gave you, every verification you ran, every communication between you, because what's about to happen at the Imperial Hotel is the story, and you need to be in the room when it does. Mara Voss looked at her for 3 seconds. Then she grabbed her bag. The drive to the Imperial took 11 minutes. Moretti had 2 cars in position by the time they arrived, which Celeste clocked from half a block away. The vehicles she had learned to recognize from 2 nights of paying attention. She got out, and Mara got out behind her, and Moretti came to meet them on the sidewalk and looked at Mara with an expression that was measured and wary and controlled. She knows, Celeste said, and she has 14 months of documentation. Moretti looked at Mara. Tristan Ashcroft has been your source, he said. Not a question. Yes, Mara said. Something moved through Moretti's expression. Not surprise that she understood now that very little surprised him, but a specific kind of satisfaction, the satisfaction of a long-running calculation finally clicking into its correct configuration. Then we go in, he said. The Imperial's lobby was open, running its regular morning business, guests moving through with luggage, staff at the desk. Celeste knew this building the way she knew her own hands. She knew which cameras had blind spots, and which elevators had dedicated service access, and which corridors connected the executive floor to the basement stairwell without passing through any public space. She moved through it now, with Moretti beside her and Declan 3 steps back and Mara behind that. And nobody at the front desk looked at her twice because she had spent 4 years being invisible in this building, and invisibility, it turned out, was a skill you kept. She took them to the executive conference room on the 43rd floor. She knew her father used it for private meetings. She knew because she had booked it for him more times than she could count. She knew he was already in it because the light under the door was the specific yellow of the room's interior lights, which were different from the corridor lights, which she knew because she had filed the maintenance ticket for the lighting discrepancy in 2021 and nobody had fixed it. She put her hand on the door handle. He's not going to expect this, Moretti said quietly. Good, she said. She opened the door. Her father was there. Tristan was there. And a third person she hadn't expected. A man in his 50s with a lawyer's bearing and a leather portfolio on the table in front of him, who looked up when the door opened with the expression of someone who had been told this meeting would be private. Reginald Ashcroft looked at his daughter. Then he looked at Moretti. Then he looked at Mara Voss, and that was the look she watched. That was the one that mattered, because her father was a man who controlled his expressions with military precision, and the thing that crossed his face when he saw Mara was not controlled, was not precise, was for one unguarded half-second the expression of a man watching a structure he'd built for 14 months begin to list. Tristan recovered faster. He always recovered faster. "Celeste," he said, and his voice carried the warmth, the practiced warmth, the warmth that had taken her 27 years to learn to hear the machinery underneath. "We were worried about you." "Were you?" she said. "You left with—" He gestured at Moretti, managing to make the gesture convey everything without saying anything that could be quoted. "Sit down, Tristan," she said. He blinked. "Sit down." He sat. The warmth dropped off his face the way a mask drops when the person wearing it has stopped seeing the point. She put the laptop on the table, the clean one from the estate, and opened it and turned it so the screen faced her father. "The session token cross-reference," she said. 47 transactions. Timestamp to sessions running from your brother's credentials. The secondary credential set generated from a device in my office during a window when I was logged in but not present. Maintenance key logs showing access to the sub-basement records office by executive key holders. She looked at her father. "Do you want me to keep going? Or do you want to tell me which parts you'd like to argue with?" Reginald looked at the screen. He looked at it with the expression of a man who had always believed that the distance between what could be proven and what was true was a distance he could manage, and was now recalculating that belief in real time. "The logistics authorization," she said. She pulled up the document. "My signature. The facility address that resolves, one layer out, to a property connected to A. Moretti Holdings, LLC." She looked at him. "You put the original documents in his facility, under my authorization, so that if anyone came looking, they'd find evidence in his infrastructure with my name on the transfer." "Celeste." Her father's voice was very quiet. The performance was still running. She could hear it, the careful modulation, the emotional register calibrated for a room where he needed to appear as the reasonable one. "You don't understand what you've walked into." "I understand exactly what I've walked into," she said. "I built the parts of it that would have buried me, and I spent 3 weeks taking it apart, and I understand it better than you do at this point, because I've been doing nothing else. There are parties involved in this situation that you are not equipped to." "The sealed addendum," she said. He stopped. "The property interest agreement I signed 22 months ago. The renovation financing instrument." She looked at him with eyes that felt very dry and very clear. "Who is the unnamed investment partner in the sealed addendum?" The room was completely still. The lawyer reached for his portfolio. "Don't," Moretti said. It was one word. It was quiet. The lawyer put his hand back on the table. "Who is it?" Celeste said again. Her father looked at her for a long moment, and in that moment she saw something she had never seen in his face in 31 years of looking for it. He was afraid. Not of her, not entirely, but of the room, of the alignment in it, of the fact that the people he had positioned as threats to each other were standing on the same side of the table. "Hargrove," he said. The air moved. Beside her, she felt more than saw Mara go very still. "Daniel Hargrove," her father said. "The Hargrove Media Group. He approached me 3 years ago. He wanted a foothold in commercial real estate, legitimate assets, cleanly held, off the media radar. The Imperial flagship was the asset he wanted. I structured the agreement to look like renovation financing because it was cleaner. Because if Hargrove's ownership interest in the hotel became public—" "His own newspaper," Mara said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "His newspaper has been investigating you," Celeste said to Moretti, and turned to her father. "Because Hargrove wanted the hotel clean, wanted it separated from any criminal proximity before he formalized his interest. So he used his own paper to run an investigation that would, what, expose you, remove you from the picture?" "Contain the liability," her father said. If Moretti's operation was publicly exposed and legally dismantled, the hotel's prior connections become a story about a corrupt family that's been cleaned up. Hargrove's interest becomes an acquisition of a rehabilitated asset. Mara's hand was on the table and it was shaking. Celeste could see it from 3 feet away. He used me, Mara said. Hargrove, my own publisher. He assigned me to this story. He gave me the source. He gave me the access. She stopped. Her jaw was tight enough to whiten the skin along it. He knew who I was. He hired me because of who I was. Because a journalist with a sealed adoption record connecting her to the Ashcroft family was the perfect person to run a story that needed to look like independent investigation and was actually architecture, Celeste said. Same as everything else. Tristan was looking at the window. He had said nothing since she'd told him to sit down, and his silence was a different quality from his uncle's silence. Not calculating, not performing, but the silence of a man who had run his operation on the assumption that the individual pieces would never be in the same room, and was now watching them assemble themselves into something he had no response prepared for. She turned to him. The credential set, she said. You generated it from my laptop. You had the executive key. You went into my office during a window when I was upstairs and you used my machine. She looked at him steadily. How long had you been planning it? He looked at her. The warmth was gone, and what was underneath it was something she hadn't seen before. Not malice, which was what she might have expected, but a kind of exhausted pragmatism, the face of someone who had made a decision a long time ago and had been living with it since. You were always going to find it, he said. You find everything. That was the problem. He looked at the table. It was never personal. It was my life, she said. It was business. You handed me to a man you believed was dangerous because it was business. I handed you to a man I knew wouldn't hurt you, he said, and something in his voice shifted. The first honest thing she'd heard from him in 4 years, and it landed like a stone dropped into still water. I knew his reputation. I also knew his record. He doesn't hurt people who aren't threats. She stared at him. You calculated that too, she said. Yes. You handed me over knowing I'd be all right. I handed you over knowing you'd be in a position where you couldn't interfere. He looked at her. I didn't know you'd... He stopped, looked at Moretti, looked back at her. I didn't know you'd end up in the same room as him, arguing the same direction. You didn't know I'd end up anywhere other than contained, she said. Yes. The room sat with that for a moment. Moretti moved then, stepped forward past Celeste, and put both hands on the conference table, and looked at Reginald Ashcroft from a distance of 4 feet, and what happened to the air in the room was the thing she'd heard described in second-hand accounts of meetings that changed the direction of things. The storage facility, he said, the original documents, my infrastructure, which you accessed without my knowledge or consent, which I will deal with separately, currently holds the primary evidentiary record of what your brother did and how your organization covered it. His voice was flat and precise as a blade. You moved those documents to create leverage over me and over your daughter. I want them returned, today. And then I want you to sit across from whoever I choose and tell them exactly what you just told this room. Reginald Ashcroft stared at him. And if I don't, then I demonstrate that the A. Moretti Holdings facility you accessed without authorization currently contains documents that implicate your organization in a fraud scheme, and I let the various interested parties draw their own conclusions about how they got there. Moretti straightened. Your daughter spent 3 weeks building a case that clears her and points where it actually points. I spent 1 night verifying it. You have nothing left to bury this with. Tristan's phone lit up on the table. He looked at it, and his face changed. What? Celeste said. He looked up. Something behind his eyes had gone out. Daniel Hargrove, he said. He's contacted his legal team. Someone told him the meeting was happening. She felt it before she understood it. The room reconfiguring, a new variable dropping in, the architecture shifting. Who told him? She said. The lawyer at the end of the table reached into his portfolio and produced a phone and slid it across the table toward no one in particular. Celeste looked at it. On the screen was a text sent 19 minutes ago from a number she recognized. She recognized it because it was the number that had texted Moretti this morning, the number logged as R. Ashcroft, her father's number. But the text had not gone to Moretti's phone. It had gone to a contact listed only as DH. She found it, all of it. Coming to the Imperial now with Moretti. Suggest you move. Celeste looked at her father. He looked back at her and the fear was gone, replaced by something older and more patient, something that had been waiting behind every other expression she'd ever seen on his face, and she understood, finally and completely, that she had been wrong about the one thing she had been most certain of. He was not afraid of this room. He had built this room. He had brought them all here. And Daniel Hargrove was already moving, and somewhere in the building below them, the lobby cameras she knew by heart were about to show her something she was not ready for. She moved before anyone else in the room understood what she was moving toward. The lobby cameras. She knew this building's camera architecture the way she knew her own handwriting. She had filed the maintenance requests. She had reviewed the security upgrade proposals. She had sat in the sub-basement for 4 years reading the footage logs when incidents required documentation. She knew that the East Service elevator had a camera that had been offline since February because the replacement part was backordered, and she had not yet escalated the ticket. She knew that the corridor connecting the East Service elevator to the fire stairwell had a 40-second blind window between camera sweeps. She knew these things the way she knew the 11-day offset in the transfer records. Not because she had been planning to use them, but because knowing them was simply the condition of paying attention. She crossed the conference room in 4 steps and pulled the fire door open. "Celeste," Moretti started. "The East Service elevator," she said without turning. "Hargrove will come through the main lobby. His security will take the primary elevators. The stairwell from the east side puts us in the maintenance corridor on 42. There's a junction there that accesses the building's internal communication system. I can lock the primary elevators from that panel." She looked back at the room. "Either you follow me or you stay here and wait for whoever he's sending up." Nobody stayed. She went first, Moretti behind her, Declan behind him, and Mara last. And she heard the conference room door click shut on whatever remained of her father and her uncle and the lawyer with his leather portfolio. She heard her father say something. Couldn't make out the words through the fire door. Didn't try. And she moved. The maintenance corridor on 42 was exactly where she had said it would be. The junction panel was behind an access door that required a facilities override code she had memorized 2 years ago when the head of maintenance had asked her to cover his emergency contacts during his surgery. She punched it in. The panel opened. She found the elevator control interface, and her hands moved across it the way hands moved across something they'd done before, which hers hadn't. But she'd reviewed the system schematic as part of a security audit in 2022, and review and practice were different things, but not entirely different things. She locked the primary bank, 4 elevators, simultaneously. The mechanism engaged with a sound like a heavy door closing somewhere distant. "That buys us time," Declan said. 8 minutes, she said. "Maybe 10. His security will find the stairwells." She looked at the panel. There was a secondary function. Building-wide intercom, connected to the security desk. She looked at Moretti. "I need your phone," she said. "The clean one." He gave it to her. She plugged it into the panel's auxiliary port, a port that existed because the building's original security designer had insisted on redundant communication pathways and had been ignored in every subsequent upgrade conversation, which Celeste knew because she had read every subsequent upgrade conversation. She opened the phone's voice memo application and hit record and said, in a voice that was clear and without tremor, "My name is Celeste Ashcroft. I am the daughter of Reginald Ashcroft and the former head of financial operations for Ashcroft Hospitality Group. I am making this statement in the Ashcroft Imperial Hotel on the 42nd floor, in the presence of witnesses, on the date of..." She named the date. What follows is a full account of the financial fraud perpetrated by Tristan Ashcroft against the operating accounts of Ashcroft Hospitality Group, the subsequent effort to conceal that fraud using my credentials and signature authority, and the involvement of Daniel Hargrove of Hargrove Media Group in the acquisition scheme that motivated the concealment. She talked for 6 minutes. She talked the way she had talked to Moretti in the kitchen, structurally, precisely, without editorializing, following the money the way she had learned to follow it, from the $40 linen invoice discrepancy all the way to the sealed addendum and the storage facility, and the 14 months of a manufactured investigation run through a journalist who had been selected for her bloodline. She named every account number she had memorized. She named every timestamp. She described the session token architecture and the secondary credential set and the 11-day offset and the logistics company and the A. Moretti Holdings facility, address, and the property interest agreement with its sealed addendum and the name Daniel Hargrove and the contact in her father's phone logged as DH and the text sent 19 minutes before she'd left the conference room. When she stopped, the corridor was completely silent. Mara was looking at her with an expression that had moved well past journalism. "That's your statement," Moretti said. "That's my statement," Celeste said. "Recorded, time-stamped, witnessed." She looked at Mara. "And I need yours." Mara blinked. 14 months of documentation, Celeste said. "Everything your uncle gave you, every verification you ran, every communication from your publisher that directed the shape of the investigation. That's not just a newspaper story, that's evidentiary material in at least 3 separate fraud cases." She paused. "And you're a witness to what happened in that conference room 2 minutes ago." Mara looked at the phone, looked at Celeste. Something moved through her face. The residue of 14 months of work built on a foundation that had just been identified as rotten, and the specific anger of a person who is very good at their job and has been used because of it. She reached out and took the phone. She talked for 9 minutes. Her account was different from Celeste's in texture, a journalist's account, organized by source and verification and timeline, with the specific precision of someone who had been building a record. But it covered the same architecture from the outside, the shape of what Tristan had given her, and when, the assignments her publisher had steered, the moments where she had felt the investigation was being managed without being able to name how. She named Daniel Hargrove 4 times. She named Tristan Ashcroft 11. When she finished, Declan took the phone without being asked and sent the audio file to 3 separate addresses that Celeste didn't see but didn't ask about. "Who gets those?" she said. "People who know what to do with them," Moretti said. "Federal people." "Adjacent," he said. She decided that was enough. From the stairwell at the end of the corridor came the sound of footsteps. Multiple, moving fast, the specific percussion of people climbing stairs with purpose. Declan shifted his weight and put himself between the stairwell door and the others, and Celeste felt the particular compression of a moment before a door opened. The door opened. 3 men. Security, private, the kind with earpieces and the careful blankness of faces trained not to react. And behind them, Daniel Hargrove. She had seen his photograph, his byline photo, his board portrait, the profile picture that ran in media industry publications. In person, he was shorter than the photograph suggested and older, and he moved with the stiffness of a man who had not expected to climb 42 flights of stairs and had done so anyway because the alternative was arriving after the situation had resolved without him. He looked at the corridor, looked at Moretti. His eyes moved to Celeste last, and she watched him process who she was, which took slightly longer than it should have because he had built a 14-month architecture around her without ever meeting her, and meeting her was a different thing. "Ms. Ashcroft," he said. His voice was boardroom smooth. "I think there's been a significant misunderstanding about the nature of the sealed addendum," she said. He stopped. "The property interest agreement in the Ashcroft Imperial flagship, the unnamed investment partner, the sealed addendum that specifies your name." She looked at him. "Who holds the original?" He was quiet for 2 seconds. That was enough. "Your lawyer," she said. "The one in the conference room with my father. He brought it." She looked at Moretti. "The leather portfolio." Moretti turned to Declan. Declan was already moving back toward the conference room junction. Hargrove took a step forward. One of his security men moved with him. "I'd recommend," Moretti said, and his voice had that particular quality it had had in the kitchen that morning. Quiet, flat, without threat in the conventional sense, but with the weight of a man who had never needed to perform threat because the reality of him was sufficient, that you stay where you are. Hargrove stayed where he was. "You built a media investigation using a journalist you hired for her genetics," Celeste said. "You directed a source to her, a source you were connected to through an acquisition conversation with my father that predates the investigation by 8 months. You use the investigation to create liability exposure around this property so that when you formalized your acquisition interest, the prior ownership would appear compromised rather than connected to you. She paused. And when the investigation started moving toward an actual conclusion, you contacted my father this morning to accelerate the timeline, which is how we ended up in the same corridor. Hargrove's jaw was tight. The boardroom smoothness had developed a fault line through it. That's an interesting theory, he said. It's an accounting, she said. There's a difference. Declan came back through the junction door. He was holding a document in one hand, not the whole portfolio, just a single folded page, the kind of page that had been tucked inside a portfolio by a lawyer who had expected to need it at a specific moment and had not expected anyone to go looking before that moment arrived. He gave it to Moretti. Moretti opened it, read it, handed it to Celeste. The sealed addendum. 2 paragraphs, formal language, the kind of legal drafting that was designed to be unambiguous. The unnamed investment partner was named, Daniel Hargrove, his personal holding company, a 40% interest in the Ashcroft Imperial flagship, to be formalized upon the completion of a regulatory review process that, she looked at the trigger clause, would be initiated by the conclusion of the Hargrove Sentinel's investigative reporting. She looked up. You structured your own acquisition to trigger on the publication of your own newspaper's story, she said, which your own source was feeding information to your own journalist. She looked at him. And the journalist was chosen because her family connection to the Ashcroft name would make the story look independent. Hargrove said nothing. His security men said nothing. The regulatory review, Moretti said. Once the story published and triggered the review, my operation gets examined. The Ashcroft family's connections to my operation create grounds for forced divestiture of the hotel assets. Hargrove acquires at distressed valuation. Through a process that looks like a clean legal outcome, Celeste said, rather than a deal. The corridor was very quiet. Mara was standing behind Celeste and to the left, and Celeste could feel her there. The particular presence of someone holding very still because the alternative was doing something they couldn't take back. My mother, Mara said. Her voice was quiet. Not soft. Quiet the way certain things were quiet, the way the records office had been quiet at 2 a.m., the quiet of a place that contained a great deal. My biological mother, she said. Did you know her? Hargrove looked at her. When you hired me, Mara said. You knew who I was. You'd done the research. She paused. My mother, Reginald Ashcroft's affair, the child given up for adoption. Did you know her? Hargrove said nothing for long enough that the nothing became its own answer. She worked for your company, Mara said. Didn't she? Before she died. Celeste turned and looked at her sister. Her name was Janet Voss, Mara said, and her voice was still that particular quiet. She worked at Hargrove Media for 11 years. She died of an illness when I was 9. I was raised by her sister. She looked at Hargrove. I always thought it was a coincidence that I ended up at the same company where she worked. I applied because of her, because she'd talked about it. She paused. She hadn't talked about it. I'd found her employment records after she died, and I wanted to be somewhere she'd been. The fault line in Hargrove's expression deepened. You didn't hire me because of my genetics, Mara said. You hired me because you knew my mother, and you knew what she'd known, and you wanted to know how much of it I knew. She looked at him with the eyes Celeste shared, the eyes both of them had gotten from a man standing in a conference room 40 feet away. What did she know? The answer came from behind them, from the stairwell, from the fire door that opened for the second time, and this time it was Reginald Ashcroft who came through it, alone. The lawyer was not with him, Tristan was not with him, and he looked at his daughters standing in the same corridor for the first time in both their lives, and something happened to his face that Celeste had no category for, that she had never seen in 31 years, and would spend a long time afterward trying to name. Janet Voss knew about the original arrangement, he said. His voice was tired. Not performed tired, actually tired. The tiredness of a man who has been holding something for a very long time and has decided, finally, that the holding is over. She worked in Hargrove's financial division. She found the original investment proposal, before I restructured it, before the acquisition framework existed. When it was still just Daniel wanting the hotel, and me needing capital, and us working out the terms. He looked at Hargrove. She came to me. Not to him. To me. She said she had documentation, and she wanted her daughter provided for, and she wanted to disappear. And you provided for her, Mara said. I paid for her care when she was ill, he said. I arranged the private adoption through channels that kept her name clean. I kept the documentation she'd found. He paused. I kept it because I understood, even then, that Daniel Hargrove was not a man you gave leverage to without keeping some of your own. Hargrove's security men were very still. Where is it? Moretti said. The records office, Reginald said. He looked at Celeste. The sub-basement. Behind the secondary boiler panel. The one with the stuck release valve that facilities stopped trying to fix because you kept telling them to deprioritize it. Celeste stared at her father. I kept it where I knew it would be safe, he said. Where I knew someone was always present. Where I knew no one would go without reason. He looked at her steadily. Where I knew you were. The corridor held all of them in it. 2 sisters, a father who was 3 different kinds of guilty, a man whose name rearranged rooms, a media mogul whose architecture had just been read aloud by the woman he'd built it around, and a journalist who had spent 14 months chasing a story that was finally revealing its actual shape. You built the contingency, Celeste said to her father. Not an accusation, an accounting. The texts to Moretti, the meeting, bringing us all here. I built a situation where everything would be in the same room, he said. Yes. You handed me over to do it. You were never in danger, he said. That is not the point, she said. No, he said. It isn't. The silence stretched, and in it she let herself feel, briefly and completely, the full weight of what it meant. 31 years of being handled, of being positioned, of being the instrument of a careful man's careful plans, even the plans that were ostensibly for her benefit. She let herself feel it the way you let yourself feel something that is going to hurt regardless, and the only choice is whether to feel it now or carry it. She chose now. The documentation behind the boiler panel, she said, combined with everything else? The session logs, the transfer records, the sealed addendum, Mara's 14 months of source documentation, the recorded statements we made 20 minutes ago. She looked at her father. That's a complete evidentiary package. Yes, he said, for Tristan, for Hargrove, for the acquisition scheme. She paused. And for you. He didn't flinch. She gave him that. Yes, he said. The federal investigators arrived 37 minutes later, not because anyone in the corridor called them. Declan's 3 addresses had done that work before Hargrove had reached the stairwell, but because the recorded statements had landed in the right places and the right people had understood immediately what they were looking at and had moved with the efficiency of people who had been watching the Ashcroft organization from a careful distance for long enough to know exactly what to do when the door opened. They came in through the lobby. They came in through the service entrance. They came in knowing the building layout because someone who knew it had provided it in a 6-minute recorded account that had been the most precise building schematic the lead investigator said she had ever received from a civilian source. Tristan was in the conference room when they reached it. He had not moved. He was sitting in the chair where Celeste had told him to sit, and the lawyer was beside him, and the leather portfolio was on the table with the addendum removed from it, and Tristan's phone was face down on the table, and when the investigators came through the door, he looked up and his face was the face of a man who had finished being surprised by things. Hargrove's security men stepped aside. Hargrove did not resist. He was a man who understood institutions and understood that certain institutional moments required a specific posture, and this was one of them. He would fight it in rooms with better lighting and people he had chosen, and he knew that. And so he went. Reginald Ashcroft walked to the primary elevator bank with an investigator on each side, and when the elevator arrived, he turned once and looked at his daughter. She was standing in the lobby, which she had come down to, which she had done deliberately and not entirely knew why. He looked at her with the face of a man looking at something he had built that had become more than he'd built it to be, and he did not apologize, because an apology was a small container for a large thing, and she thought he understood that. She looked back. She did not look away first. The elevator closed. The lobby took an hour to fully clear. Investigators, legal counsel who arrived by the third vehicle, hotel staff who needed to be managed, guests who needed to be kept calm and unaware. Celeste did most of that management herself because she knew the building and she knew the staff, and she knew that the difference between a panicked evacuation and a controlled one was usually one person who had memorized the emergency protocols and wasn't panicking. She was not panicking. She moved through the lobby with a radio borrowed from the head of security, and she coordinated the staff placements and the guest communication and the access points for the investigators' vehicles, and she did it the way she did everything, quietly, without announcing what she was doing, in the gaps between the things other people were focused on. At one point, Moretti appeared beside her. "You don't have to do this," he said. "Someone does," she said. "There are people. I know the building," she said. "Let me work." He let her work. When the lobby was finally clear and quiet, investigators in the upper floors, hotel temporarily closed, staff stood down, she went to the sub-basement. She went down the maintenance stairs, 4 flights, the way she had gone 1,000 times, and she walked the corridor to the records office and turned on the light and stood in the doorway for a moment. The desk, the stacked ledgers, the Ethernet cable coiled under the desk where she'd left it 2 nights ago, the space heater, the thermos. She went to the secondary boiler panel on the far wall, the stuck release valve. She had filed the maintenance ticket for it, had noted it as low priority because it wasn't a safety issue, had written in her notes that it could wait. She had not known she was protecting anything. She had simply done her job. She used a flathead screwdriver from the desk drawer to work the valve housing loose. Behind it, in the cavity between the panel and the concrete wall, a sealed envelope, thicker than she expected, the kind used for legal documents, with no markings on the outside. She did not open it there. She brought it upstairs. Mara was waiting in the lobby, sitting in one of the chairs that the guests used when they were checking in, with her notebook on her knee and a pen that was not moving. She looked up when Celeste came through the lobby door. Celeste sat down in the chair beside her. She held out the envelope. Mara looked at it, looked at her, took it. "You should be the one who reads it first," Celeste said. "Whatever's in there about your mother." Mara looked at the envelope for a long time. She turned it over in her hands. The same hands as Celeste's, the same shape, the same angle of the knuckles. Neither of them remarked on it. "She kept trying to tell me something," Mara said quietly, "before she got sick. I was 9 and I didn't understand what she was trying to say, and then she got sick and the trying stopped." She pressed the envelope flat on her knee. "I've spent 22 years wondering what it was." "You'll know now," Celeste said. "That's not always better." "No," Celeste said, "but it's always truer." Mara looked at her. It was the first time they had looked at each other without the pressure of a moving situation, without information being transferred, without the forward momentum of crisis requiring something from both of them. Just the looking. Just the two of them in the lobby of a hotel that was going to need a new owner and a new direction and a very thorough audit. "What happens to it?" Mara said. "The hotel." "I don't know yet," Celeste said, and then, because it was true, and because she was tired of managing the gap between what was true and what she said, "I think it might be mine, legally. Given the fraud and the misappropriation and the question of who has actually been running it." She looked at the lobby around her, the marble floors, the chandelier that needed 2 bulbs replaced on the south-facing quadrant, the front desk that had been overstaffed on weekday mornings for 6 months. "I know everything that's wrong with it." "Is that enough?" Mara said. "It's how you start," Celeste said. The legal process took months. That was the nature of legal processes. They expanded to fill the time available, and then exceeded it, and then required extensions, and then reached conclusions that felt anticlimactic relative to the events that had initiated them. Tristan Ashcroft was charged with wire fraud and financial misconduct in the first degree, and entered a plea agreement that required full cooperation and produced a documentation package that the federal prosecutor's office described as unusually comprehensive. Reginald Ashcroft was charged separately with obstruction and conspiracy, and his cooperation, which he provided because he was a careful man and careful men understood when a position was no longer defensible, reduced his exposure without eliminating it. Daniel Hargrove's acquisition scheme unraveled through 5 separate legal proceedings across 2 jurisdictions, and his media group entered a period of leadership transition that the industry press covered extensively, and Mara Voss covered in the Hargrove Sentinel under a new editorial structure that no longer had Hargrove in it. Mara's story published 4 months after the morning in the corridor. It was not the story she had been building, it was the actual story, which was better and longer and more difficult, and which named every name correctly and attributed every action to the person who had performed it and did not simplify the parts that resisted simplification. It won things. She did not come to Celeste with the news, which Celeste respected. She called. The hotel took longer than the legal process. That was also the nature of things. What you build takes longer than what you dismantle, and Celeste understood that, had always understood it, which was why she had spent 4 years in a basement building things that nobody acknowledged rather than 1 year doing something visible. She restored the employee wage structures first. Not because it was the most financially strategic move, it wasn't immediately, but because 43 employees had been underpaid for 6 years through a reclassification scheme that had been Tristan's work and had been in the operational files she had never been given access to. And the underpayment was a debt before it was a strategy, and debts came first. She eliminated the vendor contracts that had been structured for kickbacks. She renegotiated the legitimate ones. She hired a head of maintenance who actually fixed things, including the camera on the East Service elevator and the lighting discrepancy on the 43rd floor and the stuck release valve on the secondary boiler panel, which she had the maintenance ticket closed on personally. She put her name on the executive directory. Not a title, her name, her actual name, in the slot at the top of the organizational chart that had been her father's. She did not give herself a title for 3 months until the CFO, who had been innocent of everything and had survived the investigation with clean hands and a thorough record, told her that the absence of a title was creating a structural ambiguity in the organization that was causing practical problems, at which point she created the title and took it, because practical problems were problems she solved. Moretti's organization was never the story that Mara had been given. The investigation that the federal process touched was narrower than Hargrove had needed it to be, and the elements of it that were real were elements that Moretti had already begun addressing before the corridor morning, for reasons that had nothing to do with the investigation and everything to do with the fact that a man who had spent his life assessing situations had assessed this one and reached a conclusion about its direction. He was not a reformed man. She did not pretend he was, and he did not pretend to be, and the honesty of that was something she came to value the way she valued other structural things, for its load-bearing quality, for the way it made the rest of the construction reliable. He asked her to marry him in the restored records office. Not because it was romantic, he said specifically, that he was not making a romantic gesture, that romantic gestures were not his primary mode, and she said she had noticed, but because it was the place where she had been most herself. And he understood that, and he thought she should know he understood it. She said yes in the same room. She kept it brief. He appreciated that. They married in the ballroom of the Imperial Hotel on the day of its grand reopening, which was also a practical decision. 1 event, 1 security arrangement, 1 disruption to the operational calendar. The ceremony was small. The reopening was not. The night went smoothly until it didn't. She noticed the badge first. A maintenance worker near the East Corridor, the badge clipped at the wrong angle. She had looked at thousands of employee badges over 4 years, and the angle was wrong. The plastic housing was a model they had retired in the previous fiscal year. Then the boots, work boots, correct style, wrong sole pattern, the kind of detail that only mattered if you knew what the right pattern was. And she did, because she had approved the vendor contract for the employee uniform program. Then the schedule. She had the maintenance log memorized for the evening, and the man was in a corridor that had been cleared at 7 p.m., and it was 9:15. She did not run. She moved at the pace she always moved, which looked like the pace of someone who knew where she was going, which was true. She found the security director at the bar perimeter and spoke to him for 45 seconds. He found his second and spoke for 30. The emergency protocol activated in under 3 minutes. Sealed doors, redirected guests, the particular management of a large crowd that required calm authority and a very clear sense of which corridors led where, which she had provided in the protocol documentation she'd written herself 8 weeks before the reopening. She rejoined the ballroom. She found Moretti at the edge of the main floor and stood beside him and said quietly, "East Wing. 3 of them at minimum. Security has them." He looked at her. "The badge angle," she said. "What about the badge angle?" "It was wrong." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked at the ballroom, the restored chandeliers, the guests who did not know anything had happened, the orchestra playing something from the previous century that sounded like money well spent. "You know," he said, "most people wouldn't have caught that. Most people haven't read every maintenance contract for this building since 2020, she said. The 3 men were contained before they reached any public space. The guests never knew. The evening continued in the way evenings continue when the people running them have decided they will continue, which is the only way evenings like that ever do. Later, when the ballroom had thinned to the last guest, and the staff was beginning the closing process, and the chandeliers were burning at their lowest setting, she stood alone near the window where the ballroom met the building's exterior wall, looking out at the city. She could see the bridge. She could see the building's own reflection in the glass. The light behind her, the dark city ahead. Moretti came to stand beside her. He did not say anything for a while, which was one of the things she had come to understand about him, that he had an accurate sense of when words were the thing needed and when they were not, and he trusted that sense. She thought about the basement. She thought about the $40 discrepancy in the linen invoice. She thought about her father's face when the elevator closed, and Tristan's exhausted pragmatism, and Mara opening an envelope in a lobby chair with the same hand Celeste had. She thought about the stuck valve that had hidden everything, the maintenance ticket she had filed and deprioritized, the small decisions that compounded. They always called me difficult, she said. Moretti looked at her. My father, she said. My uncle. Anyone who was in those boardrooms when I corrected the numbers or found the problem or asked the question nobody wanted asked. She looked at the city lights. Difficult. Like it was a flaw. He was quiet for a moment, then, they were wrong. She looked at him. You weren't difficult, he said. He took her hand, not urgently, simply the way you took something that belonged in your hand. You were inevitable. She looked back at the city, at the lights and the river and the bridge and the dark sky above it all that held no significance she was willing to assign it, only the fact of its presence, the fact of the night continuing in the way nights did. She stood there and addressed the color of good decisions in a building she had rebuilt from the records up, beside a man who had understood from the first night that she was the only honest person in the room, and she let the evenings settle around her the way evenings settled when you had stopped bracing for them. Not peace, exactly. She was too familiar with the architecture of things to believe in peace as a permanent state, but solid ground, the real kind, tested and verified, that held because she had checked every load-bearing element herself. That was enough. That had always been enough. She had simply needed long enough to claim it,